With the popularity of movies like Disney's Aladdin, the Jinn or genie has become a mainstay creature in the West. They can be found in books, films, video games, and all kinds of media. These beings, perhaps most famous from their frequent appearance in the Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights, have a long and interesting history in the Middle East, one that is intimately connected with the religion of Islam and the pre-Islamic folklore of the Arabian Peninsula. So, for our 2020 edition of Shocktober videos, let's explore the mysterious world of the Jinn. Known in the West primarily as genie, the Jinn are associated with humanoid but ghost-like creatures that emerge from magic lamps and grant wishes. And while there is some merit to this view or portrayal of the Jinn are actually quite different in a lot of ways than what many of us assume. The name Jinn comes from Arabic and is actually in plural form, the singular of which is usually jinni, making it closer to the genie used in English. The meaning of the word is probably connected to the root form jannana, which has the primary meaning of to hide or conceal. This makes sense as the Jinn are primarily conceived of as creatures who are hidden from our regular senses and occupy a different dimension of the world. They are sort of invisible creatures. The Jinn originate in Islamic and Arabic folklore. They are mentioned in the Quran as one of three kinds of rational creatures that are created by God. The angels were created from light, the human being was created from clay, and the Jinn were created from smokeless fire. But these fiery, invisible beings predate the religion of Islam and existed as a very prominent and important part of the lives, culture, and religion of the pre-Islamic Arabs. Scholars are unsure about the actual origins of the Jinn and where they come from. Some speculate and think that they may have originally been gods in the Middle Eastern, generally the Middle Eastern region, polytheistic gods who were then kind of dethroned as the theology in the region became a bit more complex and other gods took more exalted positions in the hierarchy. Others argue that the Jinn were originally conceived of as malicious spirits who wander the deserts and old ruins. What is clear is that they have a very long history. Some scholars indeed argue that we find evidence of Jinn-like creatures already in ancient Mesopotamia. In Palmyra, which is modern-day Syria, these kinds of creatures were sometimes called jinni. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this of course leads some to argue that the origins of the word may actually be Aramaic and that the Jinn were creatures who were prominent in other cultures in the Middle East, that it doesn't necessarily originate in Arabia itself, but nonetheless the Jinn are most strongly associated with the Arab people and the Arabian Peninsula in general. They are mostly invisible spirits, similar to human beings in many ways, but with powers beyond anything that humans are capable of. They are connected to the desert and may have represented a fear by the local population of the dangers of the desert. The Jinn would hide and inhabit dark places in the desert, among old ruins and cemeteries. They can take on different shapes and forms, including as different animals like snakes, and can come into contact with, influence, and even possess human beings. Indeed, the word for madman or a crazy person in Arabic is usually majnoon, which translates to something like possessed by a jinn. To both the settled Arabs and the Bedouins, the Jinn were a prominent aspect, a prominent part of life and their culture, one that caused people to be careful when they ventured out into the desert or to sort of uninhabited dark places. But it would be beneficial to dispel some common misconceptions at this point. Sometimes people tend to equate jinn with our sort of Western or Christian conception of demons as these evil creatures who are out to hurt us or to do the bidding of the devil. But this is actually not necessarily true for jinn at all, at least not all of them. The jinn are actually more similar to how demons or daimons functioned originally in ancient Greece before Christianity made them an exclusively evil creature. In other words, the jinn are neither inherently bad or good. They are just like human beings, in fact. They live in societies, they have kings, they have friends, they get married and have children, they even have religions. And just like human beings, the jinn can sometimes be friendly and helpful, and other times they can be evil, deceitful, and dangerous. So the pre-Islamic Arabs had a strong but varied relationship with the jinn. They could be feared and seen as dangerous creatures who inhabited desolate places, but they could also be helpful and even a source of inspiration. As many of you probably know, poetry was an incredibly developed and cherished tradition to the ancient Arabs, and the jinn played an important part here. It is said that many of the pre-Islamic poets were inspired by jinn to write their verses, almost like in a possession. And here we also find further connection with the ideas of demons or daimons in ancient Greece. The daimons were often seen as the sources of inspiration that could, you could say, be messengers in between the divine world and the human world. And the jinn kind of functioned in a similar way in ancient Arabia. They would function almost like middlemen between the gods and human beings, being able to convey messages through possessing the reciter of poetry. This is also likely why some verses of the Quran claim that Muhammad's enemies accused him of being affected by magic and things like this, as jinn possession and divine recitations were a commonplace in the culture of the time. And indeed, with the coming of Islam through the Prophet Muhammad's recitation of the Quran and the religion's later vast spread, the jinn became not just a creature of local folklore, but as an essential part of a world religion. The Quran, in fact, talks about the jinn on multiple occasions and even has a surah, a chapter named Al-Jinn, meaning the jinn. So the fact that they are talked about in the Quran seems to many to confirm their existence and also help to spread this mythology to vast areas across the Middle East and North Africa and many other places. But it also placed them in a central role in the drama of the creation of the human being itself. Indeed, the Quran seems to identify Iblis, the Islamic version of Satan, as a jinn. Now, some verses seem to imply that he was a fallen angel, like in the Christian narrative, while others claim that he is a jinn, and the later interpretation has probably the most prevalent, or at least some combination of the two. Iblis was a great jinn who led jinn armies in great battles against their enemies. They fought for God, but when God created Adam, the first man, and asked all the angels to bow to him, Iblis refused. And this is the central moment where Iblis is condemned for his disobedience and becomes a shaitan, or Satan. So, according to mainstream Islamic interpretation, Iblis or Satan has a different function than in Christianity. He is not a kind of deity or powerful adversary to God, but he is the king of the evil jinn who leads human beings astray. It was quite easy for the spreading Muslims to incorporate the idea of the jinn into different local beliefs and folklores, the jinn being invisible, ghostly, spirit-like creatures, shares, of course, just by that fact, a lot of similarities with other similar creatures in different cultures, and so the jinn were often adapted and appropriated into these different cultures. Now, there is said to be different kinds of jinn, not only good jinn and evil jinn, but actually different categories of jinn, you could say. In Robert Liebling's excellent book on jinn called The Legends of the Fire Spirits, he divides the jinn into 5 categories, which are Jann, Jinn, Shaitan, Ifrit, and Marid. Important to remember here is that the lines between these are not clear at all. They are sometimes interchangeable, as those of us who have read any literature involving the jinn will surely know. But In a general sense, Jann is the most general term, referring to all kinds of jinn at large. Jinn is used to refer to specific jinn or specific tribes of families of jinn, and these can be either evil or good. So both jinn and jann are very general categories. Shaitan, however, are always evil, thus more akin to demons, as they are the children or servants of the chief shaitan, Iblis or Satan. Ifrits are generally more powerful than shaitan and are sort of more morally ambivalent, but they are mostly evil. We find the Ifrit a lot in the Arabian Nights. They like to hang out around ruins. They're often winged creatures. They can cause things like sandstorms and shapeshift into different animals. And lastly, the Marid are the most powerful kind of jinn and again are mostly evil. This is the kind of jinn we are most familiar with. The very large wish-granting kind are often a Marid category of jinn. For context, some interpret that in the famous story of Aladdin, there are two different kinds of jinn in this story. The jinn of the ring is a type of ifrit, and the jinn of the lamp, who is much more powerful, is a kind of marid. So, of course, in the Disney version, a lot of this isn't there, but in the original version, Aladdin has both a ring that has sort of magical powers and of course, the lamp. And so the jinn of the ring is thought to be an ifrit, and the jinn of the lamp is a marid. There are also further types of jinn and names, including the ghul, which is a type of jinn that likes to inhabit cemeteries, can shapeshift, and even eat the flesh of human beings. Very nasty kinds of creatures, or nasty kinds of jinn. They are often said to appear as beautiful women to lure men to their deaths. And yes, in case you were wondering, this is actually where the English word ghoul comes from. I actually didn't know this before I researched this video, so this is very fascinating to me. There are also many other kinds of jinn, but not all of which I have time to go through here. But simply put, there are many different kinds of jinn, and the lines between these categories can be very blurry. There are many different myths surrounding the jinn, many of which were spread or written down in a post-Quranic context. One such tale tells how the Jinn tribe's original homeland was a mountain called Kaf, standing on the edge of the world. As I've already mentioned, Jinn are often connected to certain places. They are said to guard treasures or haunt old ruins. There are many places around the Middle East that are thought to be infested with jinn even today. In modern-day Saudi Arabia, there is a place called Madain Saleh, which are these old ruins from the Nabatean kingdom. This place has long been thought to be inhabited by the jinn. There are even stories about how the Prophet Muhammad himself used to veil himself and walk quickly as they passed the location, telling his companions to avoid it at all costs, because it was haunted, obviously. There is also the famous story of the city of Ubar, also known as Iram of the Pillars, or Atlantis of the Sands, so called by T.E. Lawrence. This is thought to have been this great, beautiful, wealthy city in ancient Arabia that was buried in the sand, hence the name Atlantis of the Sands. Made famous by Lawrence of Arabia, or T.E. Lawrence, who wanted to search for it, as well as the 2011 video game Uncharted 3. The ruins and great treasures of Ubar are said to be guarded by the jinn. There are also very famous individual jinn. Many of these probably appear as the mythology of the jinn spread to new places, and local deities or spirits were incorporated into the mythology of the jinn. One such famous example is a jinn called Aisha Kandicha from Morocco. She has the appearance of a beautiful woman with black hair, the only difference being that she has the feet of a camel. Like the Ghul jinn, she lures unsuspecting men into the desert to kill them. Many such stories of individual jinn exist. They can also, as we have discussed, possess people, and there are various ways to exorcise a jinni. The Sufis and holy men and mystics often have a role to play in this. To remain in North Africa and Morocco, for example, one way to exorcise a jinn was to use ecstatic gnawa music. So gnawa music is a kind of North African Sufi music. So this was used often in exorcisms to get rid of evil jinn. It's incredibly interesting. If we then turn to what is probably the most famous example of jinn stories, which is of course the Arabian Nights, or more accurately the 1001 Nights, in Arabic called Alf Layla wa Layla. Here we find a whole host of different tales that includes the jinn, and some of these jinns, like the story of the fisherman and the jinn, are clearly evil and dangerous, while others can be helpful and friendly. In fact, a lot of our conceptions and ideas about the jinn, maybe most of it, comes from the Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights. This is a very important collection of stories for our understanding of Arabian or Middle Eastern folklore. As the jinn are thought to live in societies just like human beings, the jinn, as I said, also have religions. There are stories about how some jinn would listen to the Prophet Muhammad as he preached and who later converted to Islam. So there are Muslim jinn, there are also Christian jinn, there are Jewish jinn, and so on. And the jinn are subject to God's punishment at Judgment Day, just like human beings are. Even today, the jinn are an important part of the culture of the Middle East. We still sometimes hear stories about places that are infested with jinn, people who have been possessed. There was even that Netflix show called Jinn, which obviously wasn't very good at all, but still. There are also many today who are skeptical about their existence as such. Many Islamic scholars, for example, favor a metaphorical interpretation or reading of those Quranic verses that talk about jinn, while others very much still believe in them as actual creatures. And this is actually an important part of our discussion. While the jinn feature prominently in Arabic and Islamic history, in different writings, and in general just in the Islamic religion, there has been a variety about how people have understood and interpreted these creatures. While many have, traditionally and today, seen the jinn as real, actual beings who inhabit the world alongside human beings, others have read things quite differently. There seems to have been some who used jinn to refer to any phenomena or force that was not detectable by the senses. And many of the more esoterically oriented schools of theology or philosophy found interesting ways of doing ta'wil, or esoteric interpretation, on those Quranic verses. For example, the 13th century Persian philosopher Zakaria al-Qazwini wrote that, quote, "Some consider the jinn as unruly men, but these persons are of the Mu'tazila." From this, it seems that some thinkers, in this case from the rationalistic Mu'tazila school of theology, interpret the jinn metaphorically to mean a kind of human being. I'm not going to make things more complicated by discussing theology or complicated philosophies, but I just want to point out that the jinn have been interpreted differently historically, and today the situation is quite the same. While I would go as far as to say that probably the majority of people in the Middle East still very much believe in the jinn as actual creatures, there has been, as a result of different factors like Western-style education, an increasing tendency to be skeptical towards such ideas, seeing it as superstition and whatnot. So it's important to keep that in mind, of course. To sum up, the jinn are, for the most part, invisible spirits created from fire that are similar to human beings, but also have very exceptional powers. They are intimately connected with the desert and the nomadic culture of the ancient Arabs, and they come in a wide variety. Some can help you, others will lure you to your death, but all of them tickle our imagination and serves as a fascinating part of the culture of the wider Middle East. Happy October and happy Halloween, and I'll see you next time.